In September 1939, the day Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, one man made $10 million before sunset. He didn't fire a shot, he didn't sell weapons, he bought steel. And by the time the war ended, he owned 40% of America's steel production. This wasn't luck. This was the pattern. And it's happened in every war since 1812. War is sold to you as chaos, random violence, unpredictable tragedy. But that's the surface narrative. Beneath every declaration of war, beneath every government emergency, there's an economic reality so consistent, so mathematically precise, that the same families profit from every conflict, regardless of who wins or loses. This video will show you the hidden economy of war, not the battles, not the politics, the wealth transfer, how governments panic and borrow trillions, how central banks print emergency currency, and how a small group of positioned insiders capture that flood of money in 48 hours and convert crisis into generational monopolies. We'll trace this pattern through 5 wars: the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. 5 different centuries, 5 different enemies, but the exact same wealth extraction process every time. By the end, you'll understand why wars don't destroy wealth, they concentrate it, and why the people who start them are never the ones who profit most. Let's start with how it actually works. Then we'll show you how it played out 5 times in a row. Welcome to Financial Detective, where we don't predict the future, we reveal the pattern. Before we look at specific wars, you need to understand what happens in the first 48 hours after a war declaration. Because once you see it, you'll recognize it in every conflict, from 1812 to Ukraine. When war starts, governments need money immediately. Armies must be equipped, navies must be built, supplies must be purchased, but tax revenue takes months to collect. So governments do what they always do in emergencies. They borrow, but not from commercial banks, not at first. They borrow from a small network of investment banks who specialize in sovereign debt. In 1812, it was the Barings and the Girards. In 1917, it was J.P. Morgan and Kuhn Loeb. In 1939, it was Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. These banks don't lend their own money. They structure the loans, they underwrite the bonds, they distribute the debt to investors, and they collect fees on every transaction. The government gets cash immediately, the banks get commissions, and the investors get bonds that pay interest for decades. Here's the key. The government is desperate. They'll accept any terms, any interest rate, any structure, because delay means military defeat. So the banks set the terms, and those terms are always favorable to the lender. This is emergency borrowing, and it happens within hours of a war declaration. But even investment banks can't provide unlimited funding. Wars cost more than the private sector can finance, so governments turn to central banks. The central bank buys government bonds with newly created money. This is called monetizing the debt. The government issues a bond. The central bank prints money to buy it. The government spends the money on war, and the debt goes on the central bank's balance sheet. This creates inflation, because you're increasing the money supply without increasing production. More money chasing the same goods equals higher prices. But inflation is a hidden tax. People don't see it as borrowing. They see it as rising costs. And by the time they understand what happened, the war is over and the wealth has transferred. Here's the critical detail. Central bank money creation benefits those closest to the newly created money first. When the government spends war money, it goes to contractors, suppliers, manufacturers. They receive the new money before inflation hits. They buy assets, land, factories, competitors at pre-inflation prices. Then inflation arrives, asset prices rise, and the people who positioned early own the appreciating assets. This is called the Cantillon effect, and it's the core of war profiteering. First access to new money is first access to real wealth. Now comes the real play. War creates shortages. Steel, copper, rubber, oil, food, everything the military needs becomes scarce. Prices spike, and the government needs guaranteed supply, so they turn to the largest producers, the ones with existing capacity, the ones who can deliver immediately. And they offer contracts. cost-plus contracts, guaranteed purchase agreements, monopoly supply deals. The producers who secure these contracts don't compete on price. They name their price, and the government pays. Because in war, failure to supply means defeat. No general ever lost a battle and said, "But we got a good deal on bullets." This is how monopolies are born. Small producers can't compete. They don't have the capital. They don't have the connections. They don't have the capacity. So they're bought out or they fail. And by the time the war ends, 3 or 4 massive corporations control entire industries. Andrew Carnegie did this with steel in the Civil War. DuPont did it with explosives in World War I. Standard Oil did it with fuel in World War II. They didn't build their empires during peacetime. They built them during war when competition was eliminated and government contracts guaranteed profits. When the war ends, most people are broke. Inflation has destroyed savings. Small businesses have failed. Returning soldiers need jobs. The economy is in recession. But the war profiteers are sitting on mountains of cash. Cash they earned from government contracts, cash they protected from inflation by converting it into hard assets during the war. And now, with everyone else desperate, they buy land, factories, competitors, entire industries. At Depression-era prices, this is the final transfer. Wealth flows from the bankrupt many to the positioned few, and the economic landscape is permanently altered. The families who profit from war don't just get rich during the conflict. They use that wealth to dominate the post-war economy. They become the new aristocracy, and their wealth compounds across generations. 48 hours from declaration to positioning. And it's happened in every major war in American history. Let me show you. The War of 1812 was America's first test of this economic reality. The country was only 36 years old. The economy was agrarian. And when Britain started seizing American ships and impressing sailors, President Madison declared war. The US government was broke. No standing army, no navy, no money. They needed to borrow immediately. 2 men positioned themselves to finance the war: Stephen Girard, a Philadelphia banker, and John Jacob Astor, a New York fur trader turned financier. In 1813, the US Treasury needed $16 million. That's $400 million in today's money. No bank would lend. The war was going badly. British forces had burned Washington. Default seemed likely. But Girard and Astor bought the entire bond issue. $16 million, they didn't have that much cash. They borrowed against their existing assets, bought the bonds, and resold them to European investors at a markup. The Treasury got its money. Girard and Astor collected the spread, and when the US won the war, the bonds paid in full. With interest, Girard made $3 million profit. Astor made $2 million. That's $50 million each in today's dollars from one transaction. In 2 years, the US didn't have a central bank in 1812. The first Bank of the United States had been shut down in 1811. So the Treasury borrowed from state banks, and those banks issued their own currency banknotes backed by fractional reserves. This created inflation. By 1814, prices had doubled. Bread, clothing, fuel, everything cost twice as much. But the inflation didn't hit everyone equally. The government spent first. Contractors and suppliers received the new money before prices rose. They bought land and goods at old prices. Then inflation arrived, and their assets appreciated. The war created demand for ships, weapons, uniforms, food. The government needed suppliers who could deliver immediately, and the largest merchants secured monopoly contracts. Astor supplied furs for military uniforms, Girard's shipping company transported goods, and smaller competitors were shut out. They couldn't compete with the scale or the connections. By 1815, when the war ended, Astor and Girard controlled significant portions of American trade. They used their war profits to buy competitors, expand operations, and dominate post-war commerce. The war ended in 1815. The economy crashed. Soldiers returned home to find businesses closed and farms foreclosed. But Astor was buying. He purchased Manhattan real estate at Depression prices, land that would become Midtown. By 1848, when he died, Astor was the richest man in America. $20 million in 1848 dollars. That's $600 million today, built on war profits and post-war consolidation. The War of 1812 established the blueprint. Finance the war, profit from inflation, secure monopoly contracts, buy the wreckage afterward, and it would repeat with every war that followed. The Civil War was the first industrialized American war, and the wealth extraction scaled with it. When the war started in 1861, the Union needed everything: uniforms, rifles, cannons, railroads, telegraphs, ships, and the men who could supply it became the first American industrial oligarchs. The Union needed $3 billion to fight the war. That's $100 billion today. No bank could provide that. So Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase turned to Jay Cooke, a Philadelphia banker. Cooke didn't just underwrite bonds, he marketed them. He hired 2,500 salesmen to sell bonds directly to the public. Newspapers ran ads. Churches promoted them as patriotic duty. And Cooke collected a commission on every bond sold. Between 1,862 and 1,865, Cooke sold $1.5 billion in war bonds. His commission, $3 million. That's $100 million today. He became one of the richest men in America by financing the war. But even Cooke couldn't sell enough bonds to cover costs. So in 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act. The government began printing paper money greenbacks not backed by gold. They printed $450 million in greenbacks, and inflation exploded. By 1865, prices had increased 80%. A dollar bought half what it did in 1861. But the inflation didn't hit everyone equally. Government contractors received payment in greenbacks before prices rose. They bought land, factories, and goods at 1,861 prices. Then inflation arrived. Their assets appreciated, and their purchasing power multiplied. The war created unprecedented demand for industrial goods, and 3 men positioned themselves to capture it: Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Railroads, and John D. Rockefeller Oil. Carnegie started as a railroad clerk. During the war, he secured contracts to supply iron for railroads and bridges. He used the profits to build steel mills. By 1870, he owned the largest steel operation in America. Vanderbilt controlled the railroads that transported troops and supplies. The government paid premium rates. He used the profits to buy competitors and expand his network. By 1865, he controlled most rail transport on the East Coast. Rockefeller refined oil for kerosene lamps, critical for military operations. He secured contracts, undercut competitors, and by 1870 controlled 90% of American oil refining. All 3 built their empires during the Civil War. Not by inventing new technology, by securing government contracts and using war profits to eliminate competition. When the war ended in 1865, the economy boomed briefly, then crashed. The Panic of 1873 was the worst depression in American history to that point. Banks failed. Railroads went bankrupt. Unemployment hit 14%. But Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Rockefeller were buying. They purchased failed competitors at pennies on the dollar, consolidated their industries, and emerged from the Depression as the dominant oligarchs of the Gilded Age. Carnegie became the steel king. Vanderbilt became the railroad baron. Rockefeller became the oil tycoon. Their combined wealth exceeded the GDP of most countries, and it was built on Civil War profits and post-war consolidation. The Civil War proved this system worked at industrial scale and has set the template for the next century. World War I was the first truly global war, and the wealth extraction went international. When the war started in 1914, European powers needed American money and supplies, and one bank positioned itself as the intermediary, J.P. Morgan & Co. Britain and France needed to buy weapons, food, and supplies from America, but they didn't have dollars, so they borrowed from J.P. Morgan. Between 1914 and 1917, Morgan arranged $3 billion in loans to the Allies. That's $80 billion today. Morgan didn't lend his own money. He syndicated the loans, structured them, and sold them to American investors, and he collected fees on every transaction. But Morgan didn't stop there. He also became the purchasing agent for Britain and France. Every purchase they made in America went through Morgan's bank. Weapons, steel, food, oil, everything. And Morgan collected a commission on every transaction. By 1917, Morgan had facilitated $3 billion in purchases. His commission, $30 million. That's $800 million today. When America entered the war in 1917, the US government needed money. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913, bought government bonds with newly created money between 1917 and 1918. The money supply doubled. Inflation followed. Prices increased 70% between 1914 and 1920. But again, the inflation didn't hit everyone equally. Contractors and suppliers received payment first. They bought assets before prices rose. And when inflation arrived, their wealth multiplied. 3 corporations dominated World War I supply: DuPont explosives, US Steel armor and ships, and Standard Oil fuel. DuPont supplied 40% of all explosives used by the Allies. Their revenue increased from $25 million in 1914 to $318 million in 1918. Profit margins exceeded 50%. The DuPont family became billionaires. U.S. Steel produced armor plating, artillery shells, and ship hulls. Revenue tripled during the war. They used the profits to buy competitors and consolidate the steel industry. Standard Oil supplied fuel for ships, trucks, and planes. Revenue doubled, and they expanded into global markets, using war profits to dominate international oil distribution. When the war ended in 1918, Europe was devastated. But American corporations were flush with cash, and they used it to buy European assets at fire sale prices. American banks financed European reconstruction at interest. American companies bought European factories, mines, and infrastructure. The wealth transfer was complete. Europe was in debt. America was the creditor. And the families who profited from the war owned the post-war economy. World War I created the American century. Not because America won the war, because American financiers and industrialists captured the wealth transfer. World War II was the largest wealth transfer in human history, and this economic reality reached its apex. The U.S. government spent $4 trillion on World War II in today's dollars, and they financed it through bonds. The Treasury issued bonds. The Federal Reserve bought them. Banks bought them. Citizens bought them. And the debt ballooned from $50 billion in 1940 to $260 billion by 1945. The Federal Reserve printed money to buy war bonds. But the government also imposed price controls to suppress inflation. Rationing, wage freezes, price ceilings. This kept inflation visible at only 25% during the war. But the real inflation was deferred. After the war, when controls lifted, prices doubled within 5 years. And again, those who received war money, first contractors and suppliers, bought assets before the inflation arrived. World War II created the modern American corporation. Boeing, Lockheed, General Motors, Ford, General Electric all built their dominance on war contracts. Ford produced B-24 bombers. GM produced trucks and tanks. GE produced radar and electronics. And they did it on cost-plus contracts guaranteed profit margins. By 1945, these corporations controlled entire industries. And they used their war profits to dominate the post-war economy. When the war ended, America owned 70% of the world's gold reserves. And at Bretton Woods in 1944, the dollar became the global reserve currency. Every country had to hold dollars to trade, and America could print dollars to buy real assets globally. This was the ultimate consolidation. The war didn't just transfer wealth within America, it transferred global economic power to America. and the families who profited from the war owned that power structure. By the 1960s, this system was institutionalized. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about in 1961 was the consolidation of 150 years of war profiteering. Vietnam War cost $800 billion in today's dollars. And the same process played out. Defense contractors Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon secured contracts, the Federal Reserve printed money. Inflation hit 13% by 1980. And the wealth transferred from taxpayers to bondholders and contractors. Five wars, 200 years. The exact same process every time. Government panic leads to emergency borrowing. Central banks print money, creating inflation. Connected insiders secure supply monopolies. And post-war consolidation transfers wealth from the many to the few. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented economic history. And it's still happening. Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine. The system doesn't change. Only the names do. Bishlilili. War doesn't destroy wealth. It redistributes it. From taxpayers to bondholders. From small producers to monopolists. From the unprepared to the positioned. The people who profit from war aren't the ones who fight it. They're the ones who finance it, supply it, and buy the wreckage afterward. And they've been doing it for 200 years using the exact same process. If this changed how you see war not as random violence but as economic architecture, then you're starting to see how power actually works. Here's the question. If you knew war was coming and you understood this reality, would you position yourself to survive it? Or would you be the one whose wealth gets transferred? Leave your answer in the comments, and if you want to understand the other patterns the system doesn't want you to see, subscribe. Because the next video shows you the 3 assets that survive every crisis, war, inflation, depression, collapse. The same 3 every time. The pattern is permanent. The question is whether you're inside it or outside it.